Sometimes, the worst moments of our lives become doorways to something better. Young Thyra never imagined she'd be abandoned at her own wedding, left standing alone, while her betrothed chose her wealthier sister instead. The stone hall of Varngard buzzed with whispers as the clan watched her humiliation. Her heart broke as she tried to disappear into the crowd. But then a deep voice spoke beside her. "You're with me now." It was Bjarke Wolfgrim, the feared warrior who hadn't spoken to anyone since his wife died. His gentle hand touched her shoulder, and the entire hall went quiet. This giant of a man, known for his silence and strength, had just claimed her. What made him break his vow of solitude for a discarded bride? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had dawned crisp and bright over the fjords of Varngard, with the kind of golden light that promised good fortune. Thyra had woken before the sun, her heart fluttering with the nervous excitement that comes with a wedding day. She had braided wildflowers into her auburn hair and donned her mother's white wool dress, carefully preserved for this moment. The simple silver circlet that would serve as her wedding crown sat on the wooden chest, catching the early light like captured starfire. She had dreamed of this day since childhood, imagining herself walking down the stone steps of the great hall while the clan sang the ancient marriage songs. Her betrothed, Eric Ironhand, was not the handsomest man in Varngard, but he was steady and kind, or so she had believed. The match had been arranged by her father, a modest farmer who worked the harder lands on the edge of clan territory. It was a good match for a girl of her station. Eric owned 3 longships and commanded respect among the younger warriors. But what Thyra didn't know, as she carefully applied the berry stain to her lips that morning, was that power and greed were already reshaping her future. In the chief's hall, her father Olaf sat across from Eric and the clan elders, his weathered hands trembling as he held a cup of ale he couldn't taste. "The girl brings no dowry worth mentioning," Elder Gunnar had said, his grey beard bristling with authority. 3 goats and a promise of loyalty. Meanwhile, Astrid comes with gold, fertile land, and connections to the coastal traders. Eric's face had hardened as he considered the proposition. Astrid was indeed beautiful, more striking than her younger sister, with the kind of bold confidence that turned heads in any room. More importantly, she came with resources that could expand his trading ventures and secure his position in the clan hierarchy. The betrothal to Thyra was made in good faith. Olaf had protested weakly, but his voice carried little weight in this room of powerful men. "Arrangements can be altered when better opportunities arise," Elder Gunnar replied smoothly. "Your older daughter has made her interest known. A man would be foolish to refuse such an advantageous union." And so it was decided, without Thyra's knowledge, that her wedding day would become her sister's triumph and her own devastation. Meanwhile, in his solitary dwelling on the northern edge of the settlement, Bjarke Wolfgrim sat before his cold hearth, staring at the warhammer that lay across his knees. The massive weapon was inscribed with runes that told the story of his victories, each mark a battle won, each victory now feeling hollow without his beloved Ingrid to share in the glory. The hammer had been forged by the finest smiths in all of Norway, its head carved from iron found in a fallen star. The handle was wrapped in leather from a bear he had killed with his bare hands during his first winter as a man. For 20 years, this weapon had never failed him in battle. It had crushed the skulls of Saxon raiders, broken the shields of rival clans, and earned him a reputation that stretched from the windswept islands to the great forests of the east. But for the past year, since Ingrid's death in childbirth, along with their unborn son, the hammer had remained untouched. Bjarke had withdrawn from clan life, speaking only when directly addressed, taking part in no celebrations or festivals. The other warriors respected his grief and gave him wide berth, understanding that some wounds cut too deep for time alone to heal. He was a giant among men, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block doorways and hands that could crush a man's skull like an eggshell. His dark hair fell to his shoulders, streaked early with silver from the weight of loss. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when he looked at someone, they felt the weight of his attention like a physical force. Before Ingrid's death, Bjarke had been different. Still fierce in battle, still commanding in presence, but capable of great gentleness. Children had run to him without fear, knowing he would lift them high in the air and tell them stories of distant lands. Young warriors had sought his counsel, and he had given it freely. Ingrid had softened his edges while somehow making him stronger, and when she died, that balance had died with her. The clan understood grief, but they also whispered among themselves about how long one man's sorrow should silence such a valuable warrior. Some wondered if Bjarke Wolfgrim would ever truly return to them, or if he would fade into legend like the ghosts that walked the moors on winter nights. On this particular morning, as Thyra prepared for what she believed would be her wedding, Bjarke felt a strange restlessness. Something in the air seemed different, charged with possibility or perhaps foreboding. He had learned to trust such feelings. They had saved his life more times than he could count. The great hall of Varngard was a marvel of craftsmanship and clan pride. Massive oak beams, darkened by decades of smoke from the central fire pit, stretched across a space that could hold 300 people. Carved dragon heads watched from the rafters, their eyes inlaid with amber that seemed to glow in the firelight. Tapestries depicting great battles and legendary hunts covered the stone walls, and the floor was laid with stones so perfectly fitted that not even the thinnest blade could slip between them. It was in this hall that Thyra's world began to crumble. She had entered through the great doors with flowers in her hair and hope in her heart, expecting to see Eric waiting for her at the altar stone. Instead, she found him standing beside her sister Astrid, both of them dressed in wedding finery, while the clan looked on with a mixture of pity and anticipation for the drama about to unfold. Elder Gunnar stepped forward, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. "Good people of Varngard," he began, "we gather today to witness a union blessed by the gods and beneficial to our clan. Eric Ironhand, son of Magnus, takes to wife Astrid Olafsdotter, daughter of Olaf the farmer." The words hit Thyra like a physical blow. She stood frozen in the doorway, her silver wedding crown suddenly feeling heavy as lead upon her brow. The flowers in her hair seemed to mock her now, bright and cheerful in contrast to the darkness spreading through her chest. Astrid caught her sister's eye across the hall and had the grace to look momentarily ashamed. But only momentarily. Ambition had always driven Astrid harder than sentiment, and she had seen an opportunity that she could not let pass. She was 5 years older than Thyra, and had watched several good matches slip away, while her parents focused on arranging her younger sister's future first. The crowd began to murmur as they noticed Thyra standing alone by the entrance. Some whispered behind their hands, others openly stared, and a few young women, who had envied her betrothal, now looked upon her with something approaching pity. Thyra's legs felt weak beneath her, but pride kept her standing. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. Instead, she began to back slowly toward the edge of the crowd, hoping to slip away unnoticed and find somewhere private to absorb this humiliation. It was then that the shadow fell across her path. Bjarke Wolfgrim stepped into Thyra's path like a mountain emerging from morning mist. She looked up at him, through eyes bright with unshed tears, this legendary warrior who had become a ghost among his own people. His massive frame blocked out the torchlight behind him, casting her in shadow, yet somehow she felt safer rather than threatened. "You're with me now," he said again, his voice carrying just enough volume for those nearby to hear. The words were simple, but their meaning rippled through the hall like stones thrown into still water. Thyra's breath caught in her throat. She had spoken perhaps 10 words to this man in all her years in Varngard. He was a figure of legend and fear, the kind of warrior mothers used in stories to frighten misbehaving children. Yet here he stood, offering her something she couldn't quite understand, but desperately needed. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wedding ceremony continuing behind them. Bjarke's storm-grey eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "You understand," he replied. "You understand that honor matters more than gold, that promises should not be broken for convenience, that a woman's worth is not measured by the size of her dowry." The words hit their mark, not just with Thyra, but with others who had gathered close enough to listen. Several of the older clan members nodded slowly, remembering a time when such values meant more than political advantage. Elder Gunnar's voice had begun the formal wedding rites, but his words seemed to fade into the background as this unexpected drama unfolded. Thyra became aware that the entire hall was watching now, the ceremony temporarily forgotten in favor of this confrontation between the grieving warrior and the discarded bride. "But I am nothing," Thyra said, her voice stronger now but still heavy with hurt. "I bring no wealth, no connections. My father farms the hard ground, and my dowry would barely feed a family through winter." Bjarke reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she chose, and gently lifted the silver circlet from her head. The wedding crown seemed fragile in his massive hands, this symbol of promises broken and dreams shattered. "You are Thyra Olafsdottir," he said, holding the circlet up so the torchlight caught it. "You tend the sick when fever strikes the settlement. You share your family's grain with neighbors whose crops have failed. You have never spoken cruel words about those who have more than you, and you have never looked down upon those who have less." His words carried across the hall, and Thyra realized that this fearsome warrior had been watching, had been noticing, even in his grief and isolation. The thought both comforted and confused her. "I have heard you sing while you work," Bjarke continued, his voice taking on an unexpected gentleness. "The old songs that tell of honor and loyalty. The songs my Ingrid used to hum while she tended our garden." The mention of his dead wife created a moment of profound silence in the hall. Everyone knew of Bjarke's loss, but none had heard him speak her name aloud since the day she was buried. Behind them, the wedding ceremony had come to a complete halt. Eric stood frozen at the altar, his face a mask of confusion and growing anger. This was supposed to be his moment of triumph, his advantageous marriage that would secure his future. Instead, it was being overshadowed by the drama of his discarded first betrothed. "Bjarke Wolfgrim," Eric called out, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You overstep yourself. The girl was never yours to claim." The giant warrior turned slowly, and every person in the hall seemed to hold their breath. When Bjarke's attention focused on someone, it was like watching a predator consider its prey. "She was yours to claim," Bjarke replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "until you chose gold over honor. Now she claims herself, and I stand witness to that choice." Elder Gunnar stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with how this situation was developing. Political arrangements were not supposed to be challenged so publicly, especially not by someone of Bjarke's reputation and standing. "This is unseemly," the elder declared. "The arrangements have been made according to what is best for the clan. Personal feelings cannot override practical considerations." Bjarke's laugh was low and humorless. "Practical considerations," he repeated. "Is it practical to break faith? To teach our young people that promises mean nothing when better offers arise? What message do we send to other clans when they see how we treat our own?" The questions hung in the air, and Thyra could see that some of the assembled clan members were beginning to look uncomfortable. The older warriors especially seemed to be weighing Bjarke's words against their own sense of honor. Astrid, who had remained silent during this confrontation, finally found her voice. "Sister," she called out, her tone carefully modulated to sound caring rather than triumphant. "Surely you understand that these things happen for the best. You will find happiness elsewhere." Thyra looked at her sister, beautiful, ambitious Astrid, who had always gotten everything she wanted, and felt something harden inside her chest. It wasn't quite anger yet, but it was the beginning of something stronger than the hurt and confusion that had overwhelmed her moments before. "Will I?" Thyra asked, her voice carrying across the hall with surprising clarity. "Will I find happiness? Or will I simply find another arrangement that can be broken when someone with more gold appears?" The question struck home, and several young women in the crowd nodded unconsciously. In a world where women were often treated as commodities in political negotiations, Thyra's humiliation could easily become their own. Bjarke placed the silver circlet back upon Thyra's head, but this time it felt different. No longer a symbol of broken promises, it became something else, a crown of her own making, worn not for a man who had discarded her, but as a declaration of her own worth. "I offer you a place at my hearth," Bjarke said formally, using the ancient words that carried legal weight among their people, not as wife, but as family, as one who deserves protection and honor. The offer was unprecedented. Bjarke had lived alone since his wife's death, speaking to no one, accepting no visitors. For him to offer sanctuary to anyone, let alone the woman who had just been publicly humiliated, sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Thyra looked into his eyes and saw something that surprised her. Not pity, which she had expected, but recognition. He saw in her something of what he had become, someone cast aside by circumstances beyond their control, someone trying to maintain dignity in the face of devastating loss. "I accept," she said, the words coming out stronger than she had expected. "I accept your offer of protection and place at your hearth." The hall erupted into whispered conversations as people tried to process what had just happened. Elder Gunnar looked as if he had swallowed something particularly unpleasant, while Eric's face had gone red with anger and embarrassment. This was not how his wedding day was supposed to unfold. But Bjarke simply nodded once, a gesture of finality that seemed to close one chapter of the story and open another. He offered Thyra his arm, not as a romantic gesture, but as an escort might offer support to someone of importance. Together, they walked toward the great doors of the hall, leaving behind the wedding that should have been Thyra's and the life that had been planned for her. Behind them, the ceremony would eventually resume, but it would forever be remembered not for the union it celebrated, but for the moment when a discarded bride found an unexpected protector. The walk from the great hall to Bjarke's dwelling felt like the longest journey of Thyra's life. Word of what had transpired spread faster than wildfire through the settlement, and curious faces appeared in doorways and windows as they passed. Some showed sympathy, others confusion, and a few displayed the kind of hungry interest that people reserve for spectacular gossip. Bjarke's home sat apart from the main cluster of buildings, built into a natural depression that provided shelter from the harsh northern winds. It was larger than Thyra had expected, constructed of thick timber and stone, with a roof of carefully layered sod that had sprouted wildflowers in the spring warmth. Smoke rose from the central chimney, suggesting that someone had been maintaining the fires in his absence. "I have a woman from the village who comes to tend the hearth and prepare meals," Bjarke explained as they approached the heavy wooden door. "Gudrun. She lost her husband in the same raid that took 3 other good men. I pay her to keep the place from falling into ruin." The door was carved with intricate knotwork patterns that seemed to tell a story, though Thyra couldn't quite decipher the meaning. Bjarke lifted the heavy iron latch and pushed the door open, gesturing for her to enter first. The interior surprised her with its warmth and careful organization. The main room was dominated by a large hearth where a fire burned steadily, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with shelves holding books, weapons, and various treasures from distant travels. Furs covered the floor and furniture, providing both comfort and insulation against the cold. Everything was clean and well-maintained, a testament to Gudrun's careful work. What struck Thyra most powerfully, however, was the absence of feminine touches. This was clearly the home of a man living alone, practical and functional, but lacking the small details that made a house feel like a family dwelling. No embroidered cloth adorned the tables, no dried flowers hung from the rafters, no children's toys lay scattered in corners. "There is a small chamber beyond that partition," Bjarke said, pointing to a section of the room separated by hanging curtains. It was meant to be a nursery, but his voice trailed off, and Thyra understood without further explanation. An awkward silence settled between them as the reality of their situation began to sink in. In the heat of the moment, Bjarke's offer and her acceptance had felt right, even necessary. Now, standing in his private space, they were both confronted with the practical implications of what they had done. "I should explain," Bjarke said finally, settling his considerable frame onto a bench near the fire. "What I offered you was protection and sanctuary. Nothing more. I'm not looking for a wife to replace Ingrid, and you are not seeking a husband after what happened today." Thyra nodded, grateful for his directness. "I understand. I'm grateful for your kindness. But I don't wish to be a burden. I can work, I can contribute." "You are not a burden," Bjarke interrupted gently. "But yes, we will both need to find our way in this new arrangement. I have lived alone for a year, and before that, I lived with only Ingrid for many years. I am not accustomed to conversation." The admission was both honest and slightly endearing. This fearsome warrior, who could face down entire armies without flinching, was nervous about sharing his living space with another person. A knock at the door interrupted their tentative negotiations. Bjarke rose and opened, it to reveal Gudrun, a sturdy woman of middle years whose greying hair was bound back in a practical braid. Her arms were full of fresh bread and what appeared to be a pot of stew. "I heard what happened at the hall," she said without preamble, bustling into the room with the confidence of someone who had been coming here regularly. "Figured you might need a proper meal and some time to sort things out." Gudrun's eyes took in Thyra with the assessing gaze of a woman who had raised 5 children and buried a husband. Whatever she saw seemed to meet with approval, because her expression softened slightly. "You're the one who helped tend my youngest when the fever took him last winter," Gudrun said to Thyra. "Sat with him for 3 days when I had to work. Good hands you have, gentle but steady." The recognition brought unexpected tears to Thyra's eyes. In the chaos of the day, she had forgotten that her life in Varngard had included connections beyond her family and failed. Betrothal. People remembered her kindnesses, her small contributions to the community. "She'll be staying here," Bjarke said simply, "under my protection." Gudrun nodded, as if she had expected nothing less. "About time this house had some proper life in it again," she said briskly. "I'll bring extra provisions tomorrow, and we'll need to set up that small chamber properly for a young woman." As Gudrun bustled about, laying out the meal and checking various aspects of the household, Thyra began to understand that this arrangement might be more complicated than either she or Bjarke had initially realized. They were not simply 2 people sharing space, they were creating a new kind of family, with all the adjustments and negotiations that required. "Tell me," Bjarke said as they sat down to eat, "what is it you want? Not what your family wanted for you, not what the clan expected, but what you want for your life." The question caught Thyra off guard. No one had ever asked her such a thing before. Her wants and desires had always been secondary to the needs of family and community, shaped by the expectations of a society that rarely considered a woman's personal wishes. "I want to matter," she said finally, surprising herself with the honesty of the answer. "I want my life to mean something beyond being someone's wife or someone's daughter. I want to help people, to heal them when they're sick, to ease suffering when I can." Bjarke studied her face in the firelight, and she saw something shift in his expression. "There is wisdom in that wanting," he said. Ingrid felt the same way. She was learning the healing arts from old Ranveig before she died. The mention of his wife hung in the air between them, not uncomfortable but significant. Thyra sensed that this was important information, carefully shared. "I know a little," Thyra said carefully. "My grandmother taught me some herb lore before she passed, but I would like to learn more." "Randveig still lives in her cottage by the stream," Bjarke said. "Perhaps it is time someone took up that learning again." As the evening settled around them and the fire burned lower, Thyra began to sense the possibility of something she had never dared imagine: a life shaped by her own choices rather than the expectations of others. It was a fragile possibility, one that would require careful nurturing, but for the first time since morning, she felt something that might eventually grow into hope. The first week of their new arrangement passed with the careful politeness of strangers learning to share space. Thyra rose each morning before dawn, as was her habit, and prepared the fire and morning meal before Bjarke woke. He, in turn, ensured that firewood was always plentiful and that the practical needs of the household were met without her having to ask. They spoke little during these early days, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Rather, it felt like two wounded animals circling each other, taking measure while keeping a respectful distance. Thyra found herself studying this man who had rescued her, trying to understand the depths beneath his reserved exterior. She discovered that Bjarke read, which surprised her. Most warriors she knew could barely manage runes for practical matters, but his shelves held books bound in leather and written in multiple languages. When she asked about them, he explained that his travels had taken him to many lands, and knowledge had always interested him more than mere plunder. "My father taught me that a warrior's greatest weapon is his mind," he said one evening as they shared the evening meal. "A sword can break, armor can fail, but wisdom endures." On the third day, at Bjarke's suggestion, Thyra had walked to the cottage by the stream where Randveig lived. The old healer was a tiny woman with sharp eyes and hands that moved like birds when she spoke. She welcomed Thyra with knowing looks and no questions about her current circumstances. "I wondered when you would come," Randveig said, leading her into a cottage that smelled of dried herbs and mysterious tinctures. "Your grandmother had the gift, and I saw traces of it in you when you helped with the fever last winter." The cottage was a wonder of organized chaos. Bundles of herbs hung from every rafter, clay pots lined shelves from floor to ceiling, and the air itself seemed thick with healing properties. Randveig moved through this maze with practiced ease, selecting items seemingly at random but clearly with purpose. "The gift is not just knowledge of plants and their properties," the old woman explained as she showed Thyra how to properly dry meadowsweet for stomach ailments. "It is understanding that healing begins with seeing people as whole beings, not just collections of symptoms." Thyra absorbed these lessons eagerly, grateful for something to focus her mind beyond the awkwardness of her situation. Each afternoon, she would return to Bjarke's dwelling with new knowledge and dried herbs that Randveig had given her to practice with. It was on one such afternoon that complications began to arise. Thyra returned home to find Eric Ironhand waiting outside the door, his face set in the kind of determined expression that promised trouble. His wedding to Astrid had taken place as planned, but clearly the matter of his former betrothal still rankled. "I would speak with you," Eric said without preamble when he saw her approaching. "There is nothing to discuss," Thyra replied, moving toward the door. She had no desire to revisit the humiliation of that day or to justify her current circumstances to the man who had cast her aside. "There is everything to discuss," Eric insisted, stepping into her path. "This arrangement with the Wolfgrim is unseemly. People are talking, questioning what kind of relationship exists between you." The implication in his words made Thyra's cheeks burn with anger rather than embarrassment. "Let them talk," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Those who know either of us understand the nature of honor and protection." "Honor," Eric repeated with a bitter laugh. "What honor is there in a warrior taking in a cast-off woman? What protection does he offer beyond the protection any decent man would give to someone in need? More protection than you offered when you chose gold over promises," Thyra shot back, her patience finally fraying. It was then that Bjarke emerged from the house, drawn by the sound of raised voices. He took in the scene with one glance, Erik standing too close to Thyra, her defensive posture, the tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. "Is there a problem?" Bjarke asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made wise men step carefully. Erik straightened, clearly wanting to maintain his dignity, but also aware that he was dealing with a man who could break him in half without much effort. "I came to discuss the situation with Thyra," he said. "This arrangement reflects poorly on all involved." "The arrangement," Bjarke said slowly, "reflects honor on those who understand its purpose and poorly on those who question it from selfish motives." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Erik's hand moved unconsciously toward the sword at his side, a gesture that Bjarke noted but did not respond to with any visible tension. "You think me selfish?" Erik demanded. "I think you broke faith with a good woman for financial gain," Bjarke replied calmly. "I think you now worry that others judge your actions harshly, and you seek to deflect that judgment by questioning her honor rather than examining your own." Thyra watched this exchange with fascination and growing understanding. She was beginning to see that Bjarke's reputation as a fearsome warrior was built not just on physical prowess, but on an ability to see clearly through pretense and speak truth without flinching from consequences. Erik's face reddened, but he was not foolish enough to challenge Bjarke directly. Instead, he turned his attention back to Thyra. "This will not end well," he said. "Mark my words. When his grief passes and he wants a real wife, you will find yourself cast aside again." The cruel words hit their target, awakening fears that Thyra had been trying not to acknowledge. What would happen when Bjarke tired of their arrangement? What security did she really have in this unusual situation? But before doubt could take hold, Bjarke stepped closer to Erik, his massive frame casting a shadow over the younger man. "You will not speak to her again," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "You will not approach this house again, and you will consider carefully how you speak of either of us to others, because words have consequences." Erik retreated, but not before shooting them both a look of pure resentment. As he walked away, Thyra felt the weight of what had just happened. This confrontation would be reported throughout the settlement, and opinions would be formed based on incomplete information. "I'm sorry," she said to Bjarke as they watched Erik disappear around a bend in the path. "I've brought trouble to your door." Bjarke looked down at her with something that might have been amusement. "Thyra," he said gently, "I am trouble. Anyone who chooses to challenge that decision will learn the difference between a real threat and a man with wounded pride." 3 weeks into their arrangement, Thyra began to notice changes in both herself and in Bjarke. The sharp edges of her humiliation had begun to soften into something more manageable, while his rigid solitude showed cracks that let in glimpses of the man he had been before grief claimed him. The change began with small things. Bjarke started asking about her studies with Randveig, showing genuine interest in the healing arts she was learning. When she mentioned needing certain herbs that grew only on the high slopes, he offered to accompany her on gathering expeditions, claiming that the mountain paths were dangerous for someone traveling alone. On one such journey, as they climbed toward a meadow where wolf's bane grew in abundance, Thyra finally worked up the courage to ask about his wife. "Tell me about Ingrid," she said as they paused to rest beside a stream that tumbled down from the peaks. "If it doesn't pain you too much to speak of her." Bjarke was quiet for so long that Thyra began to regret the question, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried warmth rather than the sharp edge of fresh grief. "She was fierce," he said, a smile ghosting across his features. "Smaller than you, but fierce as a wildcat when roused. She once chased 3 raiders away from our door with nothing but a kitchen knife and pure determination." The image made Thyra smile despite herself. She had imagined Ingrid as a delicate flower, someone to be protected and cherished. The Reality was clearly more complex. She wanted children desperately, Bjarke continued, his voice growing softer. We tried for many years. When she finally conceived, we were both overjoyed. But the pregnancy was difficult from the start, and when her time came, he fell silent, staring at the rushing water. The midwives said there was nothing to be done, he finished finally. She was too small, the baby too large. They both fought until the end, but sometimes fighting is not enough. Thyra reached out tentatively and touched his hand where it rested on his knee. The gesture seemed to surprise them both, but he didn't pull away. She would have liked you, Bjarke said unexpectedly. Ingrid had little patience for helpless women. She admired those who found ways to contribute, to matter. Your healing studies would have impressed her. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. They began to talk more freely during their evening meals, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their observations about the people around them. Thyra discovered that Bjarke had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt safe enough to let his guard down. But as their comfort with each other grew, so did the scrutiny from the rest of Varngard. Women who had once greeted Thyra warmly now watched her with speculative eyes, wondering about the true nature of her relationship with the grieving warrior. Men who had respected Bjarke's period of mourning began to question whether his protection of Thyra was entirely honorable. The gossip reached a crescendo when Astrid arrived at their door one evening, resplendent in new clothes that spoke of her improved status as Eric's wife. Her marriage had brought her the wealth and position she had always craved, but it had also brought her face to face with the consequences of her choices. "May I come in?" she asked formally, though her eyes had already taken inventory of the comfortable interior and the obvious signs that Thyra had made this place her home. Bjarke, who had been mending a piece of tack near the fire, looked to Thyra for guidance. The decision of whether to welcome her sister was clearly hers to make. "Of course," Thyra said, though her voice lacked warmth. "You are my sister, after all." Astrid entered with the careful steps of someone walking into potentially hostile territory. She settled onto the bench, Thyra indicated, her posture perfect but tense. "I wanted to see how you were managing," Astrid began, her tone suggesting that she expected to find Thyra in reduced circumstances. Instead, she found her sister looking healthier and more confident than she had in months. "I am managing well," Thyra replied simply. "Better than I expected, actually." The answer clearly wasn't what Astrid had hoped to hear. She had come expecting to find her sister grateful for rescue, perhaps even ready to beg for help in finding a more conventional situation. Instead, she found someone who seemed to have discovered an unexpected form of contentment. "People are talking," Astrid said, abandoning subtlety for directness. "They wonder about the nature of your arrangement here. Some say it reflects poorly on our family." Bjarke looked up from his work, his attention focusing on Astrid with the kind of intensity that made most people uncomfortable. "What people say," he observed mildly, "often reveals more about their own character than about those they discuss." Astrid's cheeks flushed, but she pressed on. "I'm only concerned for Thyra's reputation and her future. This situation cannot last forever, and when it ends, what then? Why must it end?" Thyra asked, the question surprising even herself. She had been living day to day, not thinking about the long-term implications of their arrangement. But suddenly she realized that she didn't want it to end. This life, these quiet evenings by the fire, the freedom to pursue her healing studies, it felt more right than anything she had ever known. "Because it's not natural," Astrid said, her voice taking on the edge it had carried when they were children, and she was explaining why Thyra couldn't have something she wanted. "A man and woman cannot live together indefinitely without it becoming something more or something shameful." "There is nothing shameful here," Bjarke said quietly, but with absolute conviction. "Your sister has brought honor to this house and to herself. Those who suggest otherwise speak from ignorance or malice." Astrid stood abruptly, clearly frustrated that her intervention had not achieved its intended effect. "I worry about you, Thyra," she said, but her tone suggested that worry was not her primary emotion. "I fear you are building your life on false hopes." After Astrid left, Thyra and Bjarke sat in silence for a long time, both contemplating the implications of her visit. Finally, Thyra spoke the question that had been growing in her mind for days. "Bjarke," she said carefully, "what are we to each other? I know what you offered, and I know what I accepted, but what have we become?" He set aside his mending and looked at her across the firelight, his expression serious but not unkind. "We have become something that has no name in the language of our people," he said finally, "something that perhaps we must define for ourselves." The conversation with Astrid lingered in the air between them like smoke from green wood, refusing to disperse cleanly. Over the following days, both Thyra and Bjarke seemed to move more carefully around each other, as if suddenly aware that their comfortable routine might be more fragile than they had realized. It was during this period of uncertainty that fate intervened in the form of young Tor Eriksson, who arrived at their door one evening, barely conscious and bleeding from a deep gash across his shoulder. The boy, no more than 16, had been practicing with his sword when he had stumbled and fallen against his own blade. "Please," gasped the woman who had brought him, Tor's mother Sigrid. "Randveig is visiting her sister in the next valley, and you're the only one who might know enough to help him." Thyra didn't hesitate. She had been studying healing arts for over a month now, and while she was far from expert, she knew enough to recognize that the wound, though dramatic, was not life-threatening if properly tended. "Bring him inside," she commanded, her voice taking on an authority that surprised even her. "Bjarke, I need hot water, clean cloth, and the honey from the top shelf. Quickly." What followed was an hour of intense concentration as Thyra cleaned and stitched the wound, while Bjarke assisted with steady hands and quiet efficiency. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, but his breathing remained steady, and his color gradually improved. "You have good hands," Bjarke observed, as Thyra finished binding the wound with strips of clean linen. "Steady and sure. Randveig has taught you well." "She taught me the knowledge," Thyra replied, washing blood from her fingers in a basin of warm water. "But I didn't know I could actually do it when it mattered." Sigrid wept with relief when they told her that her son would recover fully with proper care. She pressed a small bag of silver coins into Thyra's hands, despite her protests, insisting that a healer deserved payment for her services. "You saved my boy," Sigrid said firmly. "That has value beyond measure." After they had gone, carrying young Tor between them on an improvised stretcher, Thyra found herself staring at the silver coins in her palm. They represented something she had never experienced before: payment for work that was uniquely hers, recognition of a skill that belonged to her alone. "How does it feel?" Bjarke asked, settling beside the fire with 2 cups of ale. "Strange," Thyra admitted. "Good, but strange. I've never had anyone pay me for anything before. Everything I did was part of family duties or community obligation." "This is different," Bjarke agreed. "This is your craft, your calling. It belongs to you in a way that nothing else ever has." The observation was more profound than either of them initially realized. For the first time in her life, Thyra had something that was entirely her own, not given by family, not dependent on marriage, not subject to the whims of others. The healing arts were hers to develop, hers to practice, hers to use as she saw fit. Word of young Tor's successful treatment spread quickly through Varngard. Within days, other people began appearing at their door seeking Thyra's help with various ailments. A farmer's wife with a persistent cough, an elderly man with joints that ached in cold weather, a young mother whose baby couldn't keep milk down. Each case taught Thyra something new, and she found herself consulting regularly with Bjarke about her patients. His travels had exposed him to healing, practices from many lands, and his perspective often proved valuable. In the Eastern kingdoms, they believe that illness often comes from imbalance, he told her one evening as she puzzled over a case involving a woman who suffered recurring headaches. Not just imbalance in the body, but in the person's life. Perhaps ask her about what troubles her mind as well as her body. The suggestion proved insightful. The woman's headaches, it turned out, were closely connected to the stress of caring for her aging mother while managing her own household. Thyra was able to help not just with willow bark tea for the pain, but with practical suggestions for organizing care duties among extended family members. As her reputation as a healer grew, so did the respect with which people regarded her living arrangement with Bjarke. What had once seemed scandalous began to appear practical, of course. A healer would live under the protection of a respected warrior. Of course, such an arrangement would be purely honorable. The gossips found less to feed on when faced with Thyra's obvious competence and the tangible good she was doing for the community. But respect from the community also brought new challenges. Elder Gunnar began appearing at their door with increasing frequency, ostensibly to check on various patients, but actually to observe and assess this new dynamic that had emerged in his carefully ordered world. The girl shows promise. He admitted to Bjarke one evening after watching Thyra successfully treat a child's fever. But she is young and untested. What happens when she faces something beyond her current knowledge? She learns, Bjarke replied simply, as all healers must. Randveig was not born knowing everything she knows now. Randveig had decades of gradual learning, Gunnar countered, and she had the backing of established tradition. This girl is creating her own path, which is admirable but potentially dangerous. The conversation revealed an underlying tension that Thyra was only beginning to understand. Her success as a healer was giving her independence and influence within the community, but it was also challenging established hierarchies in ways that made some people uncomfortable. That night, as they sat by the fire discussing the day's cases, Thyra voiced a concern that had been growing in her mind. "Bjarke," she said carefully, "I worry that my healing work might be causing problems for you. People are beginning to see me as more than just someone under your protection. They're starting to view me as someone with power of my own." Bjarke considered this thoughtfully. "Is that a problem?" he asked finally. "It might be," Thyra replied honestly. "Power in women makes some men nervous, and nervous men can be dangerous." "Let me worry about dangerous men," Bjarke said with quiet confidence. "You focus on becoming the healer you're meant to be. The rest will sort itself out." But even as he spoke these reassuring words, both of them sensed that the peaceful period of their adjustment was drawing to a close. Change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. The revelation came on a grey morning in late summer when old Henrik the fisherman arrived at their door, supporting a young woman who could barely stand. Her clothes were torn and salt-stained, her dark hair matted with seaweed, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had witnessed horrors beyond description. "Found her on the rocks below the eastern cliffs," Henrik explained as they helped the woman inside. "More dead than alive she was. Keeps mumbling about ships and fire." As Thyra tended to the woman's injuries, cuts from sharp rocks, exhaustion, and what appeared to be burns on her hands and arms, she gradually coaxed out a story that would change everything they thought they knew about their peaceful existence. "My name is Helga Magnusdottir," the woman whispered through cracked lips. "I sailed from the Orkney Islands with a trading fleet. We were attacked 3 days north of here by ships flying no banners, commanded by a man with ice-blue eyes and scars across half his face. Bjarke, who had been maintaining a respectful distance while Thyra worked, suddenly went very still. "Describe these scars," he said, his voice taking on an edge that made both women look at him with alarm. "They ran from his left temple down to his jaw," Helga said, unconsciously touching her own face to trace the pattern. "Like someone had tried to split his skull with an axe but failed to finish the job." The colour drained from Bjarke's face. He turned abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the fjord as if expecting to see ships on the horizon. "You know this man," Thyra said. It wasn't a question. His name is Ragnar the Kinslayer, Bjarke said without turning around. I gave him those scars 15 years ago when he tried to claim lands that belonged to my father's clan. He swore an oath of vengeance before I exiled him to the northern wastes. Helga struggled to sit up straighter, urgency cutting through her exhaustion. He's coming here, she said. He spoke of Varngard specifically, spoke of a debt that needed collecting. His men were asking questions about a warrior called Wolfgrim. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Ragnar had not simply been raiding trading ships for profit. He had been gathering information, building strength, planning something far more personal and devastating than random piracy. How many ships? Bjarke asked, his voice deadly calm. 7 that I saw, Helga replied, each carrying 40 men or more, well-armed, well-trained. Not farmers playing at war, but real warriors. The mathematics were sobering. Nearly 300 trained fighters against Varngard's population of perhaps 800 souls, including children and elderly. Even accounting for every able-bodied man in the settlement, they would be outnumbered 2 to 1 by professional raiders. When? Thyra asked, though she dreaded the answer. They were preparing to sail when I escaped, Helga said. With favorable winds, they could be here within 2 days. Bjarke finally turned from the window, and Thyra saw something in his expression that she had never witnessed before. Not fear, exactly, but a grim acknowledgement of responsibility that seemed to age him before her eyes. This is my fault, he said simply. My past has brought danger to people who welcomed me among them. Your past, Thyra said firmly, includes 15 years of protecting this community and earning the respect of everyone in it. Whatever comes now, we face it together. But even as she spoke the words, Thyra realized that their carefully built life was about to be tested in ways they had never imagined. The peaceful routine of healing work and quiet evenings by the fire seemed suddenly fragile, like a soap bubble about to burst against the harsh. The reality of approaching violence. Bjarke moved into action with the efficiency of a man who had faced such crises before. He sent Henrik racing to the Great Hall to alert Elder Gunnar and the other clan leaders, while he began gathering weapons and armor that had lain unused for over a year. There's something else, Helga said, as she watched these preparations. Ragnar wasn't just asking about you, Bjarke Wolfgrim. He was asking about a woman living under your protection. He seemed to know about your arrangement. The words hit Thyra like a physical blow. Somehow, their private business had reached the ears of enemies they didn't even know they had. The implications were terrifying. Who could have told him? She asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Bjarke's expression darkened as the same realization struck him. Erik, he said grimly. Erik and his new connections to coastal traders. Information travels with merchant ships, and Erik has never forgotten his humiliation at our hands. The betrayal cut deeper than Thyra had expected. To know that Erik's wounded pride had led him to share their personal business with strangers was bad enough, but to realize that this information had somehow reached a man bent on revenge added a layer of personal violation to the approaching threat. A commotion outside announced the arrival of Elder Gunnar and several other clan leaders, all of them grim-faced and moving with the urgent purpose of men who understood that their world was about to change dramatically. How long do we have? Gunnar demanded without preamble as he entered their home. Perhaps 2 days, Bjarke replied. Enough time to prepare defenses, but not enough to send for significant help from our allies. 300 warriors, said Magnus the shipwright, shaking his greying head. We might manage half that number if we arm every man and boy over 15. Then we don't fight them on equal terms, Bjarke said, his tactical mind already working through possibilities. We use the terrain, the knowledge of local waters, every advantage we can create. As the men huddled around a rough map of the settlement and surrounding coastline, planning defensive strategies and evacuation routes, Thyra found herself facing a realization that changed everything about her understanding of their situation. She was no longer simply a discarded bride who had found sanctuary with a grieving warrior. She had become a target, someone whose very existence had been noted by enemies and marked for special attention. The healing skills she had developed, the independence she had gained, the new life she had built, all of it was now at risk because of forces completely beyond her control. But rather than despair, Thyra felt something unexpected rising within her. Anger, yes, but also determination. She had found something worth protecting in this life with Bjarke, something worth fighting for. If Ragnar the Kinslayer thought he could simply sweep into Varngard and destroy what they had built, he was about to learn that his information about the situation was dangerously incomplete. "What can I do?" she asked, interrupting the tactical discussion. The men looked at her with varying expressions of surprise and concern. In their minds, the upcoming conflict was a matter for warriors, not healers. "You can prepare to treat wounded," Elder Gunnar said kindly but dismissively. "That will be service enough." "No," Thyra said firmly, "that will not be service enough. This is my home too, my life too. I want to know how I can help defend it." Bjarke looked at her with something that might have been pride. "She's right," he said to the others. "This concerns all of us. And Thyra has proven herself capable of more than anyone initially expected. The next 36 hours transformed Varngard from a peaceful settlement into a fortress preparing for siege. Every able-bodied person had a role to play, from the youngest children carrying messages to the eldest women preparing supplies. The sense of community that had always existed beneath the surface politics of clan life suddenly blazed into brilliant focus as everyone worked toward the common goal of survival. Thyra found herself at the center of preparations she had never imagined being part of. While Bjarke worked with the other warriors to organize defensive positions and train the less experienced fighters, she coordinated with Gudrun and the other women to establish medical stations throughout the settlement and prepare supplies for treating battle wounds. But her most important task came at Bjarke's specific request. "I need you to learn the escape routes," he told her as they walked the perimeter of the settlement in the grey pre-dawn light. "If our defenses fail, if the worst happens, you must be ready to lead the children and elderly to safety." The responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders. These were people who had known her all her life, who had watched her grow from child to woman, who had witnessed her humiliation and her subsequent transformation. Now they might depend on her leadership for their very survival. "Show me everything," she said simply. Together, they traced the hidden paths that led up into the mountains, the secret caves where supplies had been cached for exactly this kind of emergency, the signals that would tell those in hiding when it was safe to return. Bjarke had clearly thought about such scenarios long before Ragnar's threat materialized, another reminder of the strategic mind that made him such a formidable warrior. As they walked, Thyra began to understand the full scope of what they were facing. This was not simply a raid for plunder or slaves. Ragnar had come specifically for Bjarke, and everything else, the settlement, the people, her own life, was secondary to that primary goal. "He'll want to face you personally," she realized. As they paused at a lookout point that commanded a view of the fjord, "This isn't just about revenge, it's about proving himself superior to you in front of witnesses." Bjarke nodded grimly. "Which gives us an advantage, if we're clever about it. A man driven by personal hatred makes different decisions than one motivated by pure strategy." But Thyra could see the weight this knowledge placed on him. If the attack failed, if people died defending the settlement, Bjarke would carry that responsibility for the rest of his life. She understood now why he had withdrawn so completely after Ingrid's death. This man felt every loss as a personal failure, every tragedy as evidence of his inadequacy to protect those he cared about. "Listen to me," she said, stopping him with a hand on his arm. Whatever happens in the next few days, you are not responsible for Ragnar's choices. You are not responsible for Eric's betrayal. You are only responsible for doing your best to protect people who matter to you." The words seemed to surprise him with their directness. "When did you become so wise?" he asked, a slight smile breaking through his grim expression. "When I started living with someone who taught me that wisdom comes from facing hard truths instead of avoiding them," she replied. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a breathless boy who had been posted as a lookout on the eastern heights. "Ships on the horizon," he gasped. 7 of them, flying red sails. The moment they had been preparing for had arrived. Bjarke's transformation was immediate and complete. The thoughtful, gentle man she had come to know disappeared, replaced by the legendary warrior who had earned his fearsome reputation through decades of combat. His movements became economical and precise, his voice carried absolute authority, and his presence seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. "Signal the alert," he commanded the boy. "Tell Elder Gunnar that we have perhaps 3 hours before they reach our shores." As the settlement erupted into final preparations, Thyra felt a strange calm descend over her. All the planning, all the training, all the careful positioning of supplies and people, it was done. Now there was only the waiting and the test of whether their preparations would prove sufficient. She made her way to the great hall, which had been converted into a primary medical station. Randveig had returned from her journey the day before, and now worked alongside Thyra to organize supplies and prepare for the wounded that would inevitably come. The old healer moved with the efficiency of someone who had tended battle injuries before, her gnarled hands sorting herbs and sharpening needles with practiced precision. "You've done well," Randveig said as they laid out clean cloth for bandages. "Better than I expected when Bjarke first suggested you might have the gift for healing. You've found strength I'm not sure you knew you possessed." The observation was more profound than it might have seemed. A month ago, Thyra had been a woman whose identity was entirely defined by her relationships to others, daughter, sister, betrothed. Now she was a healer, a planner, someone people looked to for guidance in crisis. The transformation had happened so gradually that she had barely noticed it until this moment of testing. "Randveig," she said carefully, "if something happens to me today, will you make sure Helga gets safely to her family in the Orkneys? She's been through enough without becoming a casualty of our troubles." The old woman fixed her with a sharp look. "Nothing is going to happen to you," she said firmly. "You're too stubborn to die young and too useful for the gods to waste." But even as Randveig spoke these reassuring words, both women could hear the sound of war horns echoing across the water. Ragnar's fleet was approaching the mouth of the fjord, and with it came the test of everything they had built together. From their position in the hall, they could see people moving to their assigned positions throughout the settlement. Fighters took cover behind prepared barricades, while families with children began moving toward the mountain paths that would lead them to safety if the worst occurred. The sight was both heartening and heartbreaking, proof of how much these people trusted each other, but also a stark reminder of what they stood to lose. Eric appeared in the doorway of the hall, his face pale but determined. He carried a sword and wore the kind of armor that marked him as a serious fighter, though Thyra noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip on his weapon. "I want you to know," he said directly to Thyra, "that I never intended for this to happen. When I shared information about your situation with the traders, I thought it was just gossip. I didn't know it would reach Ragnar's ears." The apology was clearly difficult for him to make, and Thyra found that her anger toward him had been replaced by something closer to pity. His wounded pride and small-minded resentment had contributed to this crisis, but she could see that he was genuinely horrified by the consequences of his indiscretion. "I know you didn't intend this," she said simply, "but intentions matter less than results. What matters now is what you do next." Eric nodded, understanding that he had been given a chance to redeem himself through action rather than words. He took his position with the other defenders, and Thyra felt a moment of hope that perhaps something positive could come from this crisis, a reminder that people were capable of growth and change when circumstances demanded it. The sound of oars cutting through water drifted up from the fjord, rhythmic and ominous. Ragnar's ships were entering the narrow channel that led to Varngard's harbour, committed now to whatever course of action he had planned. There would be no turning back for any of them. Bjarke appeared at the hall's entrance, his war hammer in his hands and his armour gleaming in the morning light. He looked every inch the legendary warrior, but his eyes sought out Thyra with an expression that spoke of personal concern rather than strategic calculation. "Whatever happens," he said, "remember that you chose this life. You chose to stay, to fight, to protect what we've built together. That choice has honor in it, no matter what comes next." And then he was gone, moving toward the harbor, where Ragnar the Kinslayer waited to settle a debt 15 years in the making. Ragnar the Kinslayer stepped onto the wooden dock of Varngard with the measured confidence of a man who had planned this moment for 15 years. He was smaller than Thyra had expected, but there was something about his presence that commanded attention, a coiled energy that spoke of violence barely contained beneath a veneer of civilization. The scars that Bjarke had given him were indeed dramatic, running from his left temple to his jaw in 3 parallel lines that had healed poorly, leaving his face permanently twisted in what appeared to be a sneer. His pale blue eyes swept the seemingly empty settlement with the practiced gaze of a man who had attacked many towns and knew how to read the signs of hidden resistance. "Bjarke Wolfgrim," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the water and up into the settlement. "I know you're here. I know you can hear me. Come down and face the consequences of your actions, or watch your new home burn around the people who welcomed you." From her position in the Great Hall, Thyra could see Bjarke moving among the defensive positions, calm and purposeful despite the personal nature of the threat. He had positioned his fighters well, taking advantage of every natural barrier and prepared fortification. But she could also see that Ragnar had brought enough men to overwhelm any fixed defense through sheer numbers. The first test came when 20 of Ragnar's warriors advanced toward the settlement's main gate. They moved with the disciplined precision of professional fighters, shields locked together, spears ready. It was clearly a probing attack, designed to test the defenders' resolve and reveal their positions. Bjarke's response was swift and brutal. Hidden archers released a volley of arrows that found gaps in the attackers' formation, while defenders behind prepared barricades struck with spears and axes at any who came too close. The attack was repelled, but at a cost. 3 of Varngard's fighters were wounded, and the enemy had learned valuable information about their defensive capabilities. "First blood to us," called out Magnus the shipwright, but his voice carried more anxiety than triumph. Thyra was already moving toward the wounded, her healing supplies in hand. The first casualty was young Olaf, barely 18, with an arrow through his shoulder that had somehow found its way between the plates of his makeshift armor. As she worked to remove the shaft and clean the wound, she forced herself to focus on the medical task rather than the sounds of battle preparation continuing around them. "Will I be able to fight again?" Olaf asked, through gritted teeth as she stitched the wound closed. "Not today," Thyra replied honestly, "but if we survive this, you'll heal completely." The arrow missed anything vital. The honesty seemed to comfort him more than false reassurances would have. He nodded and allowed Gudrun to help him to a corner where other wounded could rest while remaining ready to rejoin the fight if needed. From outside came the sound Thyra had been dreading, Ragnar's voice again, but this time closer and more personal. "Bjarke Wolfgrim, you disappoint me. Hiding behind farmers and fishermen, sending boys to do a man's work. Is this what the legendary warrior has become?" The taunt was carefully calculated to provoke Bjarke into abandoning his defensive advantage for the sake of personal honor. Thyra held her breath, hoping that tactical wisdom would outweigh pride. but she had underestimated both Bjarke's intelligence and his understanding of his enemy. His response came not as a charge into open combat, but as a strategic withdrawal that drew more of Ragnar's forces into prepared killing grounds. "Fall back to the second line." She heard him command, "Let them think they're winning." The tactic worked. Emboldened by what appeared to be a retreat, Ragnar's warriors advanced more aggressively, spreading out as they pursued what they believed to be fleeing defenders. They walked directly into carefully prepared ambushes, pits covered with branches, triplines that sent men tumbling into sharpened stakes, and narrow passages where superior numbers became a disadvantage rather than an asset. The sounds of battle grew closer to the great hall, and Thyra realized that the second defensive line was under serious pressure. She could see fighters streaming past the windows, some retreating in good order, others clearly wounded or in panic. "We need to prepare for the possibility of evacuation," Randveig said quietly, her experienced eyes reading the tactical situation with grim accuracy. But even as they began gathering the most essential medical supplies into portable bundles, Thyra found herself reluctant to abandon the life she and Bjarke had built here. This hall, this settlement, these people, they had become more than just a refuge from her earlier humiliation. They had become home in a way that surprised her with its intensity. "Not yet," she said firmly. "Bjarke hasn't given the signal. We hold here until he tells us otherwise." Outside, the battle was reaching a crucial turning point, and the next few minutes would determine whether their carefully planned defense would hold or crumble under the weight of Ragnar's superior numbers. The decisive moment came when Ragnar himself entered the settlement, his personal guard cutting through the scattered defenders like a blade through water. He moved with the fluid grace of a master swordsman, his scarred face set in an expression of grim satisfaction as he approached the great hall where he knew Bjarke would make his final stand. "Enough games, Wolfgrim," Ragnar called out as his men surrounded the hall. "Face me as a warrior should, or I'll burn this place with everyone inside it." The threat was not empty. Thyra could see torches being prepared, and the smell of lamp oil began to drift through the air. Ragnar had clearly come prepared for siege tactics if necessary. It was then that Bjarke emerged from the hall, his massive warhammer gleaming in his hands. The weapon seemed to pulse with accumulated power, 15 years of victories inscribed in the runes along its head. He wore his finest armor, polished until it shone like silver, and his presence filled the space between the buildings with an almost physical weight. "Ragnar Scarface," Bjarke said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "You've traveled far to find your death." The insult struck home, and Ragnar's hand moved instinctively to touch the scars that marked his face. "I've traveled far to claim what was promised," he replied. 15 years ago, you marked me for life and cast me out. Today, I return that gift with interest. What followed was a duel that would be remembered in saga and song for generations to come. Two master warriors, each carrying the weight of personal grievance, fighting with weapons that had ended countless lives in service to their wielder's honor. Ragnar fought with twin swords, their blades singing through the air in patterns that spoke of deadly artistry. His style was fluid and aggressive, seeking to overwhelm his opponent through speed and unpredictability. But Bjarke had faced such fighters before, and his massive hammer became a defensive barrier as much as a weapon, its weight turning aside attacks that would have slipped past lesser defenses. From her position near the hall's entrance, Thyra watched with her heart in her throat as the two men circled each other like wolves seeking advantage. She had never seen Bjarke fight before, and the transformation was both magnificent and terrifying. This was the legendary warrior in full display, every movement economical and purposeful, every swing of his hammer carrying the potential for instant death. But Ragnar was no ordinary opponent. His exile had not weakened him, if anything, it had honed his skills to a razor's edge. The scars on his face were a constant reminder of his defeat, and that memory drove him to fight with a desperation that made him dangerous beyond his considerable natural ability. The first blood went to Ragnar, his blade finding a gap in Bjarke's armor near the shoulder. But the wound seemed to awaken something primal in the larger man, and his next attack came with such force that Ragnar's parry sent numbing vibrations up his arms. "You're slower than you were," Ragnar taunted as they separated briefly. "Age and soft living have dulled your edge, Wolfgrim." "Perhaps," Bjarke replied calmly, "but you're still the same angry boy who thought strength alone would win him respect." The psychological warfare was as intense as the physical combat, each man seeking to unbalance his opponent through words as much as blade work. But it was Ragnar who made the first critical error, allowing his anger to override his tactical judgment. He pressed an attack too aggressively, committing fully to a strike that would have ended the fight if it had landed. Instead, Bjarke sidestepped with surprising grace for such a large man, and his hammer swept around in a devastating arc that caught Ragnar in the ribs and sent him flying into the side of a building. The impact was tremendous, and for a moment it seemed the fight was over. But Ragnar struggled to his feet, blood running from his mouth, but his eyes still blazing with murderous intent. "This ends now," he gasped, drawing a hidden knife from his belt, even as he raised his sword with his other hand. It was a dishonorable tactic, the kind of desperate move that marked a man as willing to sacrifice everything, including his reputation, for victory. But it was also effective. The unexpected second weapon forced Bjarke to reassess his approach, just as fatigue from the extended combat was beginning to tell. Thyra found herself moving forward without conscious decision, her healer's instincts overwhelmed by the need to somehow help the man who had become more important to her than she had ever imagined possible. She had no weapon, no fighting skill, but she had something else, knowledge of human anatomy gained through months of healing work. As Ragnar prepared for his final desperate assault, Thyra's voice rang out across the combat ground with surprising authority. "Bjarke, his left knee, the old wound from the ship raid." The information was a guess, based on the way Ragnar had been favoring his left side, but it proved accurate. Bjarke's hammer swept low, striking precisely where Thyra had indicated, and Ragnar's leg buckled at the crucial moment of his attack. The collapse of Ragnar's knee sent him tumbling to the ground, his weapons scattering across the blood-stained earth. Bjarke's hammer rose for the killing blow, but something in the fallen man's expression, not fear, but a kind of broken relief, gave him pause. "Finish it," Ragnar gasped, his scarred face turned upward toward the grey sky. "You've won. Again, take your vengeance and be done with it." But Bjarke lowered his weapon slowly, his breathing heavy from the exertion of combat. "No," he said finally. "I gave you those scars because you threatened innocent people. I won't become the same kind of man by killing a defeated enemy." The decision sent a murmur through the assembled warriors on both sides. In their world, such mercy was rare and often seen as weakness. But there was something in Bjarke's bearing that spoke of strength rather than softness, the confidence of a man who no longer needed to prove his worth through violence. "Then what?" Ragnar asked, struggling to sit up despite his injured leg. "Exile again? Another 15 years of nursing hatred in distant lands?" Thyra stepped forward, her healer's instincts overriding the danger of approaching a wounded but still potentially dangerous enemy. She knelt beside Ragnar and began examining his injured knee with the same careful attention she would give any patient. "The bone isn't broken," she said matter-of-factly, "but the ligaments are torn. You'll walk again, but never without pain. Your raiding days are over." Ragnar stared at her with something approaching wonder. "You're the woman," he said, "the one who chose the Wolfgrim over marriage to a wealthy man. My sources said you were either a fool or a schemer. They never mentioned that you might be a healer. Your sources," Thyra replied as she bound his knee with strips of clean cloth, clearly didn't understand what they were looking at. The exchange seemed to shift something fundamental in the aftermath of the battle. Ragnar's surviving men, seeing their leader defeated and receiving medical care from his enemy, began laying down their weapons in gestures of surrender. The fight had gone out of them with their leader's fall, and many seemed almost relieved to have the long pursuit of vengeance finally ended. Elder Gunnar approached cautiously, his weathered face showing the strain of the day's events. "What do we do with them?" he asked, gesturing toward the defeated raiders. It was Bjarke who answered, but his eyes sought Thyra's as he spoke. "We offer them choice," he said. "They can sail away and never return, or they can stay and earn their place among us through honest work, but no more raiding, no more vengeance. That cycle ends here." The offer was unprecedented, and several of the clan elders looked skeptical. But Thyra found herself nodding in approval. It was exactly the kind of solution that the man she had come to know would propose, one that broke the cycle of violence rather than perpetuating it. Many of Ragnar's men chose to sail away, taking 3 of the 7 ships and disappearing into the northern waters. But others, perhaps weary of the raiders' life or impressed by the mercy they had been shown, chose to remain. They would spend years proving themselves worthy of trust, but some would eventually become respected members of the community. Ragnar himself chose exile once again, but this time it was different. His leg wound had indeed ended his career as a warrior, and the defeat had somehow broken the obsession that had driven him for 15 years. As he prepared to leave on the ship designated for those who chose departure, he approached Bjarke one final time. "I understand now," he said quietly, "why you spared me all those years ago. Killing me would have been simpler, but it wouldn't have been just. I was too young and too angry to see the difference then." "And now?" Bjarke asked. "Now I'm too old and too tired to care about vengeance," Ragnar replied, with something that might have been a smile. "Perhaps I'll find a quiet place to spend my remaining years thinking about better choices I might have made." As the ships departed and the immediate crisis passed, Varngard began the slow process of healing and rebuilding. The dead were honored, the wounded were tended, and the damage to buildings and defenses was repaired. But beyond the physical restoration, something deeper was taking place. The crisis had revealed the true strength of the community and the bonds that held it together. People who had once whispered about Thyra and Bjarke's unusual arrangement now spoke of them with respect and gratitude. Their partnership, forged in the aftermath of public humiliation, had proven itself in the crucible of genuine danger. On a quiet evening 3 weeks after the battle, as the last of the repairs were being completed, Thyra and Bjarke sat by their fire as they had so many times before. But something had changed between them, not dramatically but subtly and permanently. "What are we now?" Thyra asked, echoing the question she had posed months earlier, but with a different tone. Then she had been seeking definition for something uncertain. Now she was acknowledging something that had already become clear. "We are what we've always been," Bjarke replied, reaching over to take her hand in his massive one. "Two people who found something unexpected in each other's company. Two people who built something worth defending." "Is that enough?" she asked. "It's everything," he said simply. Outside their window, Varngard settled into another peaceful evening, its people secure in the knowledge that they had faced their greatest test and emerged stronger. And in the small house where a fist, legendary warrior, and a discarded bride had found their unexpected family, the future stretched ahead with possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine when this story began.